Stay with the 30-minute version. Could you please give me the signal when the time is up so I don't go over? I'll just be reading some sections from the paper, so if it's a tad disjointed, I apologize for that. Well, it's obvious that Catholic social teaching developed by Pope Leo XIII and his successors owes much to St. Thomas Aquinas. Though he composed no classical treatise on political philosophy, the late career De Regno being the only possible exception, Thomas did manage, in the course of his voluminous writings, to sum up the best of the biblical sources, the church fathers, and the classical philosophers regarding the great themes of political thought. And this made him the prime inspiration for the modern popes as they turn to questions of property, the common good, right rule, just war, etc. But I wonder whether sufficient attention has been paid to the manner in which these more practical and moral considerations are grounded ultimately in Thomas's understanding of the source of existence. On his reading, we know who we are and how we ought to behave at both the personal and societal levels, precisely in the measure that we have an at least inchoate sense of who God is. Therefore, Aquinas' doctrine of God is an indispensable propedeutic to any consideration of his social and political doctrine. As always with Aquinas, metaphysics comes first and ethics follows. Accordingly, in this paper, I'll explore, however briefly, the relationship between Thomas's very distinctive notion of God as ipsum esse and some principal themes of Catholic social teaching. So first, who God is. Though Thomas is famous for saying that regarding God, we don't really know what he is, but only what he is not, that statement only tells part of the story. For along with theological language under the rubric of the via negativa, think infinity, immutability, eternity, etc., Aquinas employs terminology under the rubric of both the via positiva and the via eminentiae. He affirms, for instance, that God is good, perfect, omniscient, and omnipotent. A term that Thomas applies to God that hovers, as it were, on the border between the negative and the positive way is simple. By this word, he signals that essence and existence coincide in God. This means, on the one hand, that God cannot be defined or known categorically, hence the term is a function of the via negativa. On the other hand, the same term implies that God is the fullness of what it means to be, hence the word is a prime expression of the via eminentiae. To make all this clearer, we must recall that in Thomistic ontology, essence, or quidditas, is a principle of potency, vis-a-vis existence, or esse, which is an active principle. Thus, for example, the human being is the actus essendi, delimited by the quidditas of humanity, existence actualizing, as it were, the potentiality that lies within the essential principle. We grasp this merely potential nature of humanity when we understand there's no difference as such between humanitas in an actually existing human being and humanitas subsisting simply as a notion within consciousness. Thomas articulates the idea of this real distinction more generally in the De Ante et Essentia. I'm quoting now, "But every essence or quiddity can be understood without understanding anything about its existence. I can understand what a human being is or what a phoenix is, and nevertheless not know whether either has existence in reality." Close quote. With this fundamental demarcation in mind, Aquinas, in that same early text, mounts an elegant argument for God's existence, more convincing really, I think, than any of the famous five at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae. Whatever a thing has must come to it either from its proper nature or from an extrinsic cause. Hence, to use his famous example, risibility pertains to a human being by nature, whereas light obtains in the atmosphere only through the ongoing influence of the sun. But in something marked by a real distinction between essence and existence, its active to be cannot belong to it properly. It must therefore have arrived through an extrinsic efficient cause. I'm quoting again from Thomas. And since everything that is through another is reduced to that which is through itself as to a first cause, there is something that's the cause of existence in all things. In that this thing is existence only. Ipsa est esse tantum. If we might put this in a pithy formula, that which merely has being is reduced finally to that which is being. The conclusion of the demonstration is that there is a reality in which essence and existence coincide, or better, something that's utterly unmarked by even a trace of potentiality.
hence actus purus. Now, what should be clear is that this ultimate metaphysical ground cannot be construed as one existent among many, not a type of being at all. As he states startlingly enough in the Summa Theologiae, this reality is not in any genus, even the genus of being, which is why throughout his career Thomas prefers the term ipsum esse subsistens for God rather than ens summum, which would designate the most impressive item in the set of beings. Here Thomas's theological language is congruent with Anselm's famous description of God as id quo maius cogitari nequit. For the reality signified by that descriptor could not be simply the highest being, since the highest being plus any other being would be greater than that highest being alone. With respect to Anselm's description, God plus the entire world would not be greater than God alone. Or as my former professor Robert Sokolowski expressed it, quote, after creation there were more beings, but no more perfection of being, close quote. Now, from these rather high theological claims regarding the nature of God, a number of conclusions can be drawn with respect to the created order. As we've seen, that in which there's a real distinction between essence and existence must depend in the most radical sense upon the causal influence of ipsum esse. It is not the case that creation is a relation that obtains between a supreme existent, God, and more mitigated forms of existence. God and created things do not relate to each other in that standard Aristotelian sense, whereby a relation mediates between two or more things. Indeed, Thomas goes so far as to say, it's in the De Potentia, that creation is quaedam relatio ad creatorem cum novitate essenti. It's a kind of relationship to the Creator with newness of being. So that, here's the implication, the creature is a relation to God all the way down. This implies furthermore that God is, as Thomas puts it in the second Summa, in all things by essence, presence, and power. And then he adds intime, most intimately so. So not an event sequestered at the beginning of time, creation is indeed continual, creatio continua, Thomas says. God sustained the universe moment to moment, or as Herbert McCabe has it, in the manner of a singer sustaining a song. Though, as we'll argue anon, God is certainly other than his creation. He is, as Catherine Tanner has it, otherly other, which is to say non-contrastively or non-competitively other. In accord with his analogical conception of being, Thomas would never hold that God and creatures can be compared or contrasted in the ordinary sense of those terms. Neither do they jostle with one another for dominance on the same ontological grid. Instead, God can come intimately close to a creature without compromising the integrity of that creature. The burning bush being a prime sort of image of that in the Old Testament. Now, I understand this language might easily lead one to conclude that Thomas is a near pantheist, but this, of course, must be resisted. For he insists as clearly on the distinction between God and the world as he does on the proximity of God to the world. There can indeed be no real comparison between that which exists through the power of its own essence and that which derives its being entirely from another. Between creator and creatures there yawns an infinite existential abyss. Though God's otherness is non-contrastive, it remains total. God is totaliter aliter. Actus purus could never be confused or commingled with entia, beings marked by potentiality. A very positive implication of this aspect of Thomas's teaching is that the created realm, even in its radical relationality to God, has its own relative independence. By the very act of creation, God opens up a space that's proper to the finite order, allowing its own integrity. Thus, we can speak, for example, of the causal relationships and ontological principles that obtain within the material and political orders without making constant reference to the first cause. This is once again precisely because that cause is not one among many, competing within the nexus of contingent causes and agents. The paradoxical claim that we've been exploring, that God is, as Augustine had it, simultaneously intimior intimo meo et superior sumo meo, carries unavoidably the implication that God has loved the universe into being. According to Aquinas' well-known formula, to love is to will the good of the other. If this is the case, then the cause that's fully actualized, and that hence has no existential defect whatsoever, can direct his will ad extra only in a completely unself-interested manner. He can only will the good of the other, since what is other to him can be of no possible advantage to him ontologically. This means that the very transcendence of God, his totaliter aliter quality, is what permits him to desire and make possible real human flourishing. To me, it's fascinating how Thomas is always on this sort of razor's edge in his ontology of God. Following furthermore the speculations of the theologians of that school of radical orthodoxy, we might observe as well that God's act of creation, understood this way, must be construed as non-violent. In so many of the myths that have come to us from the ancient world, the act of creation is construed as a violent conquest, one god or set of gods defeating others. Typically in these accounts, the elements within the universe are interpreted as the severed and scattered body parts of the defeated deities. And we could even read the more rational accounts of the beginning of the world offered by the classical philosophers as refined versions of these primal myths. Thus Plato's Demiurgos, surveying the forms, intrusively shapes matter. Aristotle's prime mover, in a similar way, molds prime matter by means of irresistible attraction. But ipsum esse, who brings every aspect of finite reality into being ex nihilo, cannot even in principle intervene or aggressively manipulate anything in the act of creation. Rather, it takes place non-violently, on the biblical telling, not through an act of conquest, but through an act of speech. Much more I want to say about that, but I'm going to skip to now some implications for the political and social order from these metaphysical musings. Having surveyed these pivotal theological and metaphysical issues, we're in a position to make at least some observations regarding Thomas's conception of the political and social order. I would draw attention first to the framing of political action made possible by Thomistic ontology. As we saw, the act of creation by which God gives rise to a dimension of being really distinct from his own clears out a space for both nature and society. So instinct-based evolution can happen within the material world, and voluntary evolution can happen within the human body politic. At the same time, the created universe is not independent of God or set conventionally over and against God, as perhaps the deists might have it. Rather, ipsum esse functions non-competitively as both sustaining efficient cause and alluring final cause of all created reality. As an illustration of this paradox, I think it's instructive to consult the narratives in 1 and 2 Samuel in the Old Testament. Whereas in earlier biblical accounts, God involves himself in straightforwardly interventionist way. Think of God simply appearing as an embodied being. In the later and theologically subtler Samuel stories, God's activity is never in question, but the manner of his activity is indirect. It might be better to say that God is operating at a qualitatively different dimension of reality, permitting him to be present to our history without crudely manipulating it. One could legitimately interpret the entire sweep of the Samuel narrative in political or psychological terms, making perfect sense of all that happens. But then one is compelled by the narrator to appreciate the constant and yet non-competitive influence of God throughout. A next implication of Thomas's doctrine for social theory I'd like to examine is the relationship between humanity and the rest of natural creation. Shaped by his biblical vision and by his metaphysical account of ipsum esse's rapport with the created order, Thomas certainly affirmed the interconnectedness of all things and the signal importance of the material world. We know a major feature of his embrace of Aristotelianism was a turning toward the physical rather than away from it, which would have been a tendency in his more Platonizing predecessors. The sheer goodness, variety, and fecundity of nature he takes to be expressive of the infinity and intensity of divine perfection. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis evokes Thomas precisely on this score. I'm quoting now from the Pope. St. Thomas wisely noted that multiplicity and variety come from the intention of the first agent, who wills that what was wanting to one in the representation of divine goodness might be supplied by another, close quote. Aquinas famously comments that we come to know God through two books, the Scriptures and creation, both of which express God's word. And like his biblical and patristic forebears, he appreciated salvation as taking place within a properly cosmic context, the incarnation saving not only human beings, but in one sense the entirety of creation. This view is given particularly rich expression in the opening verses of the book of Genesis. In insisting that God created earth, planet, sun, ocean, and animals, Genesis was, on the one hand, dethroning these elements, all of which, at various times and in various cultures, were worshipped as deities. But on the other hand, it was demonstrating the role that they legitimately play within the scope of God's providence. For they come forth, one after the other, in a kind of stately liturgical procession, at the end of which are the first humans, who take up the role of leaders of the praise. So Eden is understood as a sort of primal temple, the first humans as priests, the rest of creation as the choirs singing a hymn of praise to the Creator. Once again, since ipsum esse has no ontological deficit, the praise offered him by creation adds nothing to his greatness, but redounds to the benefit of those who offer it. The Jerusalem temple, decorated inside and out with symbols of the non-human creation, symbolically expressed the way in which the entire cosmos cooperated with the sacrifices Israel made to God. All of that, it seems to me, is deeply connected to this idea of God as non-competitively transcendent. This biblical and pre-modern vision of a deep integration between humanity and the cosmos gave way at the dawn of the modern period. The breakdown of metaphysics of participation had a great deal to do with this, which would be a good topic for another conference. But a principal consequence of the shift is that nature came to be seen as an object for human manipulation, something to be mastered, or in the still alarming language of Francis Bacon, a victim to be tortured so that it might reveal its secrets. Pope Francis speaks frequently in Laudato Si of the, quote, technocratic paradigm, namely one, I'm quoting again, that exalts the concept of the subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object, close quote. This method might be construed as appropriate within a purely scientific context, though even there, Goethe's challenge to the aggressive style of Newtonian science would have to be taken into consideration. But certainly when applied to human beings or to the environment as a whole, its dangers and inadequacies appear quickly enough. Again, this is from Pope Francis. It can be said that many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the working of society. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in the deterioration of the environment, close quote. The technocratic paradigm, the Pope argues, is a function of the anthropocentrism characteristic of modern philosophy and finally inimical to a biblical vision. Again, I'm quoting, anthropocentrism has paradoxically ended up prizing technical thought over reality, since the technological mind sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility. It views the cosmos similarly as a mere space into which objects can be thrown with complete indifference, close quote. A facet of Pope Francis' critique that's too often overlooked is how the technocratic paradigm represents a sort of neo-Gnosticism, which teaches contempt for the body. When the body itself becomes simply an object of manipulation for the rational ego, abortion, euthanasia, and transgenderism become acceptable moral options. Close to time. One more little section I'll read. A final conclusion regarding social theory I'd like to draw from Thomas's theology of God has to do with the universal destination of goods. A first text to consult is question 22 of the Prima Pars, which deals with divine providence. In response to the question whether God's providence extends to all things, Aquinas says, quote, "The causality of God, who's the first agent, extends to all being, not only as to constituent principles of species, but also to individualizing principles. Hence, all things that exist in whatsoever manner are necessarily directed by God towards some end." Close quote. This means that all finite being is necessarily under the direction of ipsum esse. In a word, the world and all that's in it belongs to God. Were God understood in the typically deist manner, simply over and against the world, we might speak of certain things or certain dimensions of creation escaping his purview and control, but such a view is irreconcilable with the participation metaphysics. From this consideration, we can turn to the matter of legitimate use and ownership of the goods of the world. In question 66, Article 2 of the Secunda Secundae, Aquinas distinguishes with respect to property between the potestas dispensandi and the potestas procurandi. Following largely Aristotelian prompts, Thomas offers a number of arguments in support of the right to procure goods for oneself, but then he speaks of the usus, the use of what one owns. I'm quoting, "In this respect, man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that, to wit, he is ready to communicate them to others in their need." Close quote. Though it's stated in the laconic style typical of Aquinas, this idea is quite explosive. It's congruent with Ambrose's observation to the effect that if a man has 2 shirts in his closet, one belongs to him, the other to the man who has no shirt. And it corresponds to Leo XIII's teaching in Rerum Novarum that, quote, "Once the demands of necessity and propriety have been met, the rest of what one owns belongs to the poor," close quote. As the papal expositors of Catholic social teaching have propounded again and again, this principle is grounded in the fact that all things, moment by moment, come into being through the creative agency of God and therefore belong to God and are destined for his purposes. Just one more quick remark. Though he was accused by some in the West of Marxism for his troubles, Pope Francis relies upon this Thomistic distinction in Fratelli Tutti. Along with all of his papal predecessors in the social teaching tradition, Francis clearly affirms the legitimacy of private property and the entrepreneurial market economy. I'm quoting from him here, "Business activity is essentially a noble vocation." Let me skip that section. But then he makes the necessary corrective, quote, "Business abilities, which are a gift from God, should always be clearly directed to the development of others and to eliminating poverty, especially through the creation of diversified work opportunities. The right to private property is always accompanied by the primary and prior principle of the subordination of all private property to the universal destination of the earth's goods, thus the right of all to their use," close quote. What's novel in Fratelli Tutti is the Pope's insistence that this distinction between ownership and use ought to apply not simply to individual moral agents, but to nations as well. And I'll give him the final word. Nowadays, a firm belief in the common destination of earth's goods requires that this principle also be applied to nations, their territories and resources. Seen from the standpoint not only of the legitimacy of private property and the rights of its citizens, but also of the first principle of the common destination of goods, we can then say that each country also belongs to the foreigner, inasmuch as a territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. Once again, God's continual creation of the universe prompts a reconsideration of the obligations of nations toward one another. Obviously, much more can be said in my fuller paper. There's many more points I'm going to make. But I hope I've shown, at least in a cursory way, the very clear connections between the very distinctive theology of God in Aquinas and some of these key ideas in the social and political order. God bless you all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Bishop Barron, not only for your brilliant presentation, but also for, you're very punctual, This is, so we are complementing cultures here. Okay, so the next speaker will be Professor Hans Joas. He will be talking on organic social ethics and the sacredness of the person, Thomas Aquinas as a challenge for sociological theory. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. I also would like to thank, first of all, Anna Marta for having invited me, and I'm very happy to be here. So when the discipline of sociology emerged in the last decade of the 19th century, none of its founders was Catholic or had the slightest affinity with the Catholic Church. When, at exactly the same time, the Catholic social doctrine was formed in the preparation of the encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891, it was defined by theologians and clerics on the basis of medieval thinking, and in particular the revitalization of the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. For the early sociologists, a return to medieval thinking appeared completely misguided and inappropriate for the problems of modern society. The proponents of the Catholic social doctrine, in their turn, ignored the insights of the emerging new discipline and looked at it with great skepticism. Thus, a serious dialogue between the two intellectual developments was blocked from both sides from the outset and for a long time. Things have changed in the meantime, but much more could be done. In my contribution, I will try to encourage an intensification of such a dialogue by dealing with three questions. First, what was the historical constellation around 1900? I try to offer a somewhat more precise picture of it. After that, I will focus on two specific aspects of Catholic social thought, namely what one could call its organicism and its personalism, and investigate the relationship between these two aspects and the sociological theories of Max Weber on the one hand and Emil Durkheim on the other, the two most important classical figures in the discipline of sociology. The common denominator of these two topics, organicism and personalism, and my personal reason for choosing them, lies in my interest in the history of what one can call moral universalism and a Christian understanding of such a moral universalism. The historical constellation. When I mentioned the emerging discipline of sociology, I was not